Okay, so let's get started. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the lab, then we will get on with the lecture. Okay, but before we do that, we can start with the story of the week. So this is about the cow, the economist, mathematician, and the statistician. I don't know if you've heard of this one. So the story goes as follows. There is a train that is passing through the countryside, and there is an economist, statistician, and a mathematician on the train, and they see a field with a cow. And the economist says, "Look, there is a black cow, and so all cows in this country must be black." And then the economist says, well, not the economist, the statistician says, hold on, that's not quite true. What you can say is there is at least one cow in this country that is black. And then the mathematician says, even that is not the case. All you can say is there is at least one cow in this country which has at least one side that is black. So the moral is, be careful of what you can infer from what your experiments and data are telling you in your papers. Okay. All right. So moving on to project one. So a few things I wanted to announce. I'm assuming that either you have already decided to do the lab by yourself, or you have found a person to work with. If you are having difficulty finding a lab partner, okay, please post to Piazza, and if you exhausted all alternatives, then come see me, and I will try to see if I can find someone. I cannot guarantee it. I would like all of you to figure this out yourself, but if you're really having difficulty and want to work with someone, please come and talk to me. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is, I am assuming by this time most of you have at least looked at the lab, if not started on it. And if you haven't, then it's really you're doing yourself a disservice by trying to work on it at the last minute. Okay, you will have the usual time crunch and then run into difficulties, and there won't be much you can do because you'll run out of time. So please start early. If you finish early, great, and if not, you still have enough time to finish. Okay, so we have a little over a week for the lab. Okay, so I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the lab itself. Go to the course page. So the goal of the assignment, as you probably have realized, is you have to use P2P networks in some way, use some form of communication, and what you use, whether it's sockets, RPCs, RMIs, left to you. You have to ensure some amount of concurrency and threading in your code, so no single threaded processes. Okay? So you have to make all the design decisions of things we've been talking about. How are you going to assign, have requests come in, how will they be serviced, and so on. Okay? And where there are data structures that are shared and so on, you have to use synchronization. That's the broad goal. The assignment itself is basically to use this notion of the Angry Birds game. Excuse me. I have to do something that you just find fun to do. So I presume you looked at the assignment. Okay, so the idea is that you want to basically come up with a version where you have these birds launching on pigs, but pigs now can take some evasive action. The way they are going to do this is they are going to form a P2P network and estimate the trajectory of the bird, and basically communicate that among the network. And if a pig finds itself in a region where a bird is going to land, it is going to take some evasive action. Okay, the assumption is that messages will actually take some time to propagate. So you have to estimate, you have to assume that there is some delay, okay, and maybe even simulate that delay. Okay, and depending on the topology of the network, the messages will take a certain amount of time to traverse the n hops that they need to get from the sending bird to all of the recipients. Okay, if a bird arrives at its destination before the messages reaches, then no evasive action can be taken. Okay? If on the other hand the message is propagated before the bird arrives, then you can be successful in taking evasive action. So this will all depend on the relative size, speed at which a bird is going to launch itself, and the topology of the network and how messages propagate through your network and so on. What you can assume, as we have mentioned, is that the topology can be determined statically. You don't have to dynamically form the network. Okay, so you can form the topology of your network statically. But once you form the topology, every time you do repeat the game, that you use the topology, but the positions of the peers of the pigs in this case will keep changing. Okay? So two pigs that were neighbors previously in the P2P network may no longer be neighbors. Okay, in the physical space they may be neighbors, but in the topology they may not be neighbors. They may have to communicate through some number of hops. Okay, so that's the way you have to sort of build the application. Okay, so that's very broadly what we want to do. Okay, now I'm going to see if there are questions first, because I had said come look at it and come with questions. So maybe you can ask a few, we can clarify some issues that may not be clear. Yes?
So I think a lot of people have been confused about the words you use, like trajectory and estimate and bird.
Yes.
Right? Because it seems to me like the only way to set this up is to be like a discrete, one-dimensional world where you have pigs or stones or nothing.
Yes.
And then where the bird is going just has to be told to one of the things. Because there's no like arc or anything.
Okay, so question is, there's some confusion about, there shouldn't be confusion about birds. Birds are well-known objects. So I did, so you will see that there is a reason lot of things are unspecified, because on the one hand we want you to exercise some creativity in what assumptions you make, and on the other hand you can make design decisions or the right assumptions, and that this is somewhat deliberate. This is what will happen in the real world. Somebody will come to you saying, here are the specs, and lots of things will not be specified. So you have to figure out what's not specified, either seek clarifications or make the right assumption. Okay, now having said that, you asked about how is it that you are going to estimate the trajectory. Okay? So you can assume that there is one bird or one pig which is closest to the bird that is going to watch how the pig is going to how the bird is going to launch and propagate that. Now, how does it estimate that? In this case, you can assume that you said we could just assume that the bird, before it launches, somehow communicates that. Okay? Fine, that may be fine assumption. You could basically make that assumption, or what you could do is you can basically have, let's say, the first few coordinates of the bird be given to the pig, and the pig can estimate a trajectory. It's up to you what you want to assume. Okay? In the end, as you can imagine, from the perspective of the course, we really care more about what are RPCs, are you using them the right way, are you using threading the right way, concurrency the right way. Rest of it you can make reasonable assumptions. All reasonable assumptions are acceptable. If you think you are overly simplifying something with your assumption, ask, is this too strong an assumption that trivializes the project? Okay? In this case, I would say that trajectory estimation, we will accept any reasonable assumption, including the one you just mentioned. That would be perfectly fine. Okay? Yes, question.
So, regarding oversimplifying the assumptions, could I assume that after getting 3 coordinates of the bird, I could estimate exactly where it's going to fall?
Yes, so you can assume that after you get the first 2 or 3 coordinates, you can assume that it's an arc of some sort of parabola or whatever.
Yeah.
And say our trajectory is always this, I am going to just do a simple curve fit and estimate it. Fine. You could assume I don't want to deal with all that, the bird just tells me where it is going to land. Also, I will take that. That would be a simplified version of what you do. Okay. the speed is something you have to estimate as well, because the speed will actually determine when it will land as well. It's not just the trajectory. In some sense, there are a few things you have to figure out. What time it will arrive and where it will arrive. Okay, those are the two things you need to estimate. Okay, yes.
When I do it, put all the pigs on the same machine, there is no delay between the communication. So need I add some delay, random delay?
Yes.
Yeah.
So your peers will not necessarily be running on different machines. Okay? So if you actually try to take the real message delays and use that, you are going to get almost no delays because messages will go through very quickly. So you have to emulate a delay. Okay? Otherwise, you will basically have messages go by instantaneously. You will never have a case where the bird arrives before the pig has taken evasive action. So you should emulate a delay. Okay? Whether you emulate it by having a sleep in the peers before they propagate, or you just have the notion of fake time, where you just say when this message arrives, so much time has passed. That is up to you. Okay? But you should not assume that the real network delay you see on a single machine is an estimate of real delay. That would not be the case. In reality, these peers would be on different machines, but here you are going to do it all on one machine.
In the problem, like with each bird launch, is the topology of the P2P network changing or just the physical location of the page?
Okay. So question is, after each bird launch, is the topology of the P2P network changes or the position? Okay. So topology should stay fixed, position should change. And what this will mean is two pigs, that were close by may now be further apart. Okay. So you don't want to keep changing the topology, but do change the position. There was also a question of should pigs be on one-dimensional grid or two-dimensional grid. Again, that is up to you to exercise some creative freedom. You could assume that the pigs are on a grid, right, like they're in the real game. So you can say, I have 4 pigs and there are 8, so I will put them in some location, okay, and I have some stone columns, and you randomize this every time. Or you could assume that they are on a linear thing and there are columns and these are the pigs and the bird is launched. Both of those are okay assumptions. Now, depending on what you assume, you have to be able to figure out when a bird lands on a pig, who does it impact? Clearly, that pig will be hurt, but we said it can topple over onto a neighboring pig. So here, you basically have sort of a pig that is to your left, right, top and bottom that will be impacted. In this case, you may impact the two neighboring, the left and right peers. But move on. Okay? Yes.
So our assembly is a P2P network, and I think we should link to an administrator something program to send a message to the first pig, right? And state the worst cause.
So are you assuming, you're asking that you want to have the bird tell the pig where it's going to land? Is that your question? I'm
Yeah,
not
so
following the
how to
question.
notice that? So how to generate a random location for the pigs, and how to notice the first pig, and how to get the score back winning the marathon.
Okay, so how do you decide how to start the game? Is that your question?
Yeah.
So you can assume that the game can be started by the user, like you would normally have. And then once you start the game, you initialize it. Okay, so you have to pick a random seed and then assign all these positions, and then start.
So I can just broadcast the message, and I don't need to.
You don't broadcast, you use a P2P network to propagate the messages.
So
That is the whole point of the exercise. If you just broadcast it to all of them, then what's the point of having the P2P network? So you will have a P2P network and messages will propagate depending on whether you use a structured or unstructured, then there will be a way to route messages through your P2P network. That's what you are going to assume. So each peer will only send messages to its neighbor in the P2P network. You can't broadcast in this.
So when I get back the scores, I need to send a message to some pig, and then I get back.
Yes, it will propagate through the network, yes, exactly. Yes.
So if a pig goes down in a hit, we'll have to modify the entire network topology for the subsequent one?
No. After every, so the question is once the bird has landed, then you keep score saying what happened, did the bird hit or not, and you can figure out how to keep score. Then you reinitialize. So exactly what you do in
the pig, the node of the pig.
the pig is only hurt, and once you reinitialize, all pigs are actually come back to life. Okay, so this is what you do in the game. Okay, so you basically do multiple rounds of this. Okay, yes,
What pigs can take evasive action? Can the pig that is going to be directly hurt by a bird, can it only take evasive action, or neighboring pigs around it also can take evasive action based on the messages?
So question is, what pig should take evasive action? Should only the bird that is hit or all the neighbor? So the basic idea is if you are going to be directly hit, or your neighbor is, you can estimate that your neighbor is going to actually topple over you. Okay, so you should take evasive action. So that basically means that a pig that is going to be directly impacted or indirectly impacted because a bird hit your neighbor. So so essentially neighbors of the pig that is going to be impacted should also take evasive action. Okay. The only issue is how quickly are your messages propagating, and will they actually get there before the bird arrives. Okay, so you can try slow speeds, fast speeds, and say if you have an n hop network and messages that, let's say, take 10 milliseconds, I'm just making up some numbers, then so it may take n times 10 milliseconds for messages to actually get through the network. If the speed of the bird is such that it arrives before n times 10, then some pigs may get impacted. Okay, so you can decide, try to play around with the parameters and see. You can also construct the topology in a smart way, saying it's completely up to you how you construct the topology, right? You can have a fat network, a thin network which has a smaller diameter, so messages get through faster. So there's a lot of creativity you have, you can play with.
As a follow-up question, so in that case, if a bird impacts a stone, so this could lead to a cascading effect if if the stone is in the first position and there are just a bunch of stones or something like that,
Yeah.
after that then it can lead to a cascading effect where the last pig also gets affected. So all of that has to be taken care of.
Yes, so if the arrival coordinate of a bird is a stone column, the assumption is that the stone column will fall on a bird and then that bird will fall on a neighbor. Or if there is so any cascading impact you have to take into account. I am going to suggest that you don't have a sequence of stones. You can just simplify it by saying there are relatively few, so you don't have to deal with too much complication. Okay, so you can make some simplification. But the idea is, if you have a pig that is getting impacted, the pig falls on a stone column, the stone column may then fall on some other pigs next to it, right? So you can have that level of some small number of cascading things you can take into account. You don't have to belabor it and make it overly complicated. Okay, yes.
Can we use a centralized server to coordinate all the peers?
Can you use a centralized server? What do you mean by what coordination do you want to make?
I mean, maintain a list of all the peers and know who is the neighbors.
No, so in a P2P network, each peer knows its neighbor. There is no centralized system here.
So
That's
it's
the whole point of a
serverless.
P2P network. The only thing you can assume is if you, let's say, have a linear sequence, there's a bird launching from somewhere. The first pig is the closest, so we'll assume it has the best way to estimate the trajectory. So it is going to basically initiate the message communication, saying a bird has taken off, this is his estimated position and arrival time, and you broadcast that through your network. So that's all. So you can assume that there is some initial pig that's going to start this off, and beyond that, there is no centralized control
So
anymore.
all the neighboring information will be stored in the peers.
Yes, as in a real P2P system, right? If you assume centralization, there's nothing to really do. That centralized entity could do it all. Right?
And another question is about the estimation. If the first pig knows the trajectory and the angle of the
Launch.
bird, it knows exactly the position the bird will land.
Yes.
So what do you mean by the estimation? Do we need to add some ROC to that?
No, so if you assume that the pig can estimate the position, you're done. That just essentially says that I've just figured that out. Or as I was saying, you could say, I look at the first 3 coordinates of the bird and then do some trajectory estimation. But again, there is some leeway in what you assume there. You can just assume you know it and be done with it. Okay, any other questions here? Yes.
Are there any number of hops in the take shelter method?
Are there any number of, so every P2P message that you send should have a hop count. The reason for the hop count is if you are using flooding, okay, your message will never die. It will just keep on circulating. Because what flooding essentially means, if you receive a message from the peer, you just forward it to your neighboring peers. Right? So if you don't have a hop count that's decremented in flooding, messages will circulate forever. They will never go away. So this is why any message that is sent through the network always has a hop count. Okay? And again, the choice of hop count is a parameter. The choice of the hop count may actually impact some issues. So if your diameter is n, that means the maximum length through the network is n, hop count you choose to be less than n, then some messages may never get to all the pigs. They will actually get terminated before they propagate through the network. Okay? In this case, if you can experiment with hop count and say maybe with a hop count less than n, 20% of the messages never get to the pigs, so they are not able to take evasive action or whatever. So that's another parameter you can play with, yes.
So can I, instead of using a hop count, assign some identifier to the message so that a peer never forwards the message twice?
You could basically, instead of a hop count, assign an identifier, and then a peer will never have to forward a message twice. You could do that. The only thing is then you made the peer stateful. Every message that goes through, you have to keep track of this. I have actually forwarded this message. You never know when to discard that state, because if you don't know the diameter of the network, you don't know after how long can it come back to you. Okay? It may not necessarily come back twice. It may come back many times because it will circulate, it's flooding. So there may be many paths to come back to it. So you could make that stateful assumption, but then you have to say something about when do you throw away a state of a packet you've already seen. Can you make a reasonable assumption there? If you can, perfectly acceptable. Okay? Yes.
So after we've got all this set up and after our network is working, there's a couple statistics that you want us to collect, right? And that's things like how many pigs on average get hurt, and like how fast does the message propagate, and like,
so you can change some parameters and see how it impacts. Like you can make messages propagate more slowly, and or make the pigs launch faster, and see does it actually have an impact. How quickly can the pigs take it? This is just a way to. I mean, these are very trivial experiments, to be honest. They're not going to give you any earth-shattering insights. But the goal is to actually do what you do in real research. You just think about the design of your system, understand what are the parameters that can have an impact on the behavior, and see how it changes the behavior. Okay, so that's really the goal. You can construct any experiment of that sort, but really is to get to teach you how to do systems research. It's a sort of a toy example, really. Okay? All right, so if there are more questions, this has been recorded. If there are more questions, ask, or even better, post on the news forum, so everyone can see the questions and what questions are being asked and what answers are being provided. Okay? All right, so we will continue with the lecture. Okay, so there are a couple slides from last time, then we'll talk about naming today. Okay, so we are talking about streaming, okay, and stream-oriented communication. I said basically very different from request-response, message-oriented communication. Essentially, this is audio and video delivery, so you basically only send one message to the server, and the server can actually keep streaming data to you. Okay? And we also said that in streaming, you tend to not use protocols like TCP because, or you shouldn't use protocol like TCP because retransmissions can cause data to arrive late, and late data is as good as not getting the data at all in some cases. Okay? Now, I'll actually, having said all of that, I'm going to say a little bit about how streaming actually works today when you use whether YouTube or anything, any sort of video or audio that you stream over the network. How does it work? So there's a very important difference between what you think should be the right thing and what is actually done in practice. So on the one hand, not having retransmissions, using UDP-like protocols might be inherently better for streaming. Yet almost all of the streaming that happens on the internet actually goes over HTTP. Okay? And HTTP runs over TCP. So essentially, protocols are used, basically the streaming protocols that you see, they are HTTP or TCP based. Okay, UDP protocols are specialized protocols. If you know Real Server or Microsoft also had its own video player. They all had customized protocols that they developed that are UDP based, fairly sophisticated. They would keep track of what kind of user experience user is seeing. They could vary the quality at which data is being sent based on how much bandwidth is available at the user. Is it dial up or broadband or LAN? So they were fairly sophisticated server side protocols. Okay? Yet none of that actually ever took off. What is most common today is you simply use HTTP, just as you fetch a web page over HTTP. So you can fetch a video file over HTTP and simply play it out. There's nothing smart that is being done. You just send an HTTP request for a video file rather than an HTML file, and the file just comes to you and you start playing. Okay? Now typically if the file is very long, let's say it's a 1 hour lecture that we have captured, you don't want an entire 4 gig or 5 gigabytes of data to be downloaded before you can start playing. Because the way most browsers will work is they'll wait for the entire requested object to arrive before they start playing it or rendering it. Okay? So the way HTTP streaming works is basically if you have your file, you partition it into smaller pieces, smaller files, let's say. Okay? Each piece will have a part of that video or audio. Okay? So I've shown, ignore the colors, let's just take the blue color. So if you have a file that has video, here we have basically partitioned it into 4 pieces. Let's say it's a 20-second video, you have 5-second chunk. Each is an independent file that you can request. So what your player would simply do is it will get ask for the first file over HTTP, just as you send a normal request. Once this file comes, it will start playing it out. While the file is playing out, it will request the next piece of the video. Okay? And it will start downloading it. And the hope is that if you do it right, before this chunk finishes playing out, this portion of the video has already been downloaded using HTTP, and then you can just start playing that out. Okay, so you don't see this actually happening in the player, it just looks like a smooth playback, but you are actually fetching multiple pieces using HTTP. Okay, now, so this is very simple HTTP streaming. Now there are some sophisticated things you can do, which is if there are heterogeneous clients, that some clients are connecting over LAN. Some may be trying to watch this over, let's say, on your phone, and phone is connected over 3G, the bandwidth is much lower than, let's say, what you get over Wi-Fi or LAN. How do you deal with all those intricacies? Okay. In HTTP streaming, there is no intelligence at the server. That the server is simply a vanilla HTTP server. Okay. All the intelligence is essentially put on the client side. Okay. Your client player, which is in your browser, the YouTube player, the flash player that you may be using, or any other player, is going to keep sort of is where you put the intelligence. So what the server will simply do is when you ask for a video file, it will say I have 3 versions of it. I have one encoded at high bit rate, let's say 512 kilobits per second video. Same data is available at medium quality and low quality. Right? It says you can pick which one you request. Okay? So I have the same file in 3 qualities. Okay, same data, and the player can request. Okay, so the player can implement whatever technique it wants. So it might say optimistically, I think this machine is on a LAN, so I'm going to go for the highest bit rate one, and say I'm going to ask for the blue version of that data. Okay? So now higher quality data will come to you, and as you're downloading, the player can keep statistics. Is the data coming quickly? Is there too much loss? Okay, you can keep that statistics, and based on what you're observing for playing out this chunk, then when it comes to request the next part of the video, you can say, should I continue at this quality, should I drop it or increase it? Okay. If you see problems here, like there are playback glitches and you have to rebuffer or data is not coming, you drop quality. Say next time I'm going to request the red, which is the medium quality. Okay. And if that doesn't work, then you can decrease it further to the lowest quality. And maybe the network starts getting better, you can up the quality. Okay, so as you play it out, sometimes you can actually see if your network is behaving in an odd way, you will suddenly see the quality is actually the video is beginning to look grainy. Okay? And then after a while it improves again. The reason that's happening is in the middle your video player on your browser actually requested a lower quality version of that chunk. Okay, and you started playing that. That's why you see a reduction in quality. And once the network improves, it will actually start increasing the quality again. Okay? So all this is done at the client end. The server is simply an HTTP server that basically has encoded the video at multiple qualities, and you can just request them as individual chunks or data objects over HTTP. Okay. So now all of this is over TCP, so which means there is no need to worry about retransmissions and so on at the class or server end. Okay, at the same time, the reason all of this works is because you can have very large buffers at the client. I mean, the network speeds are reasonable now. If you have megabit per second connection, right, which even 3G provides, and video is actually maybe only 100 or 200 kilobits per second, that is perfectly fine to get, over even a 3G connection. So as a result, you don't really need to worry too much about retransmissions and so on. There is adequate bandwidth available to stream, which is why this works at all. And furthermore, you can, since the data comes at a reasonably fast speed, you can keep a little bigger buffer to deal with any problem. Okay, last time I said the client buffer is really where you can try to mask some of this problem. If you have a large enough buffer, you have time to retransmit and fetch data and so on. Yeah, so that's basically where you can avoid putting too much complexity into the streaming protocol. Okay. Now, what I mentioned here, which is the ability to select multiple quality video, this is referred to as dash streaming, okay, which is direct adaptive streaming over HTTP. Okay, so you are basically adapting the quality of the video playout based on network conditions that are being observed. Any questions here? So I'm going to talk a little bit about stream synchronization, and then we'll switch to meaning. So what is the problem of stream synchronization? So whenever you have a stream that is coming to you over the network, typically that stream has multiple components. Okay, basically there are at least two components, an audio and a video. Okay, so if you're basically playing out any let's say video file, it actually has images that are being displayed, and there is audio that is being also played out. Okay, the data contains two essentially sub-streams, an audio stream and a video stream. Typically, to actually get good playback performance, the playout of the audio and the video have to be synchronized. Okay, in particular, you have to have what is called lip sync. When the person their lips are moving, what you want to hear from the speaker are the same words that the person is uttering. If you lose synchronization, you will see effects where the person appears to be speaking, but there's a lag in the words actually being played out. Okay, the reason is you lost synchronization, okay, and that doesn't give you good quality, right? User experience in some sense. This especially becomes a problem, let's say, when you're doing Skype video conferencing. Okay, what Skype is doing is the images are being captured by the camera, the audio is being captured by the microphone. So there are two recording devices that are capturing the data. The video is being captured using your camera, and the microphone is capturing the audio. Okay, so each of these devices is producing an independent data stream. In one case, there's a sequence of images. In another case, it's a sequence of samples. Okay? If you just simply send this data over, and then the end client is just playing them in the order in which they're arriving, you will quickly lose synchronization. Okay? You need to know exactly when an audio sample was captured and what frame was captured at the same time, and play them out together. Okay? This is referred to as audio-video synchronization. So I'm going to draw a picture here. So let's say you're doing Skype, and this is your machine. It has a camera and it has a microphone. Okay? And so this is a person here. So this is generating images and sending it out. The microphone is actually generating audio data and sending out. On the other end, if you don't know that when this image was being captured, this is the audio sample that was captured. Okay, if you cannot relate that, you won't be able to figure out what should I play when I'm displaying this frame, this image. Which words or which part of the audio stream should I play out. Okay? So you have to synchronize the two. Okay, what's the easy way to do this? Okay, you timestamp. The trivial thing is you basically have a clock. So whenever you capture an image from the camera, you look at the current time and you put the timestamp on. Whenever the microphone is recording, you look at the current time and you timestamp it. And you send the timestamps with both the audio and video. At the other end, whenever you basically, to ensure synchronization, you always play out the data that has equivalent timestamps. Okay, so when you display an image, you have to display audio at a similar timestamp, otherwise you are going to lose synchronization. Okay. So if you don't have a protocol that does that, you will see problems like what you typically see, because the audio and video are not synchronized. Okay. This is often the problem in live data, like you do Skype conferencing, because there are two recording devices. If you simply have, let's say, a MPEG file that you are playing, the audio and video are already timestamped and already sort of put in the file at the right places. So you don't need to worry about it. So you'll have an image, and then the audio data for that image will be put in the file right after it. So you'll get the image and the audio data will be there, and you just play it out together. You don't need to do anything special. You only need to do something special when these two streams are going independently over the network, which sometimes happens when you do live conferencing. Then when you play it out at the other end, you have to synchronize. Okay. So this is referred to as stream synchronization. Okay. The only reason I mention this is we will come back to synchronization in a little bit, because it's going to be a big problem in distributed system is timestamping and figuring out how to correlate events in a distributed system is a sort of a much more general problem. Here the events are when you play out the two data from the two streams and how to synchronize them. This is our first encounter of a problem where you need to synchronize something, and we will come back to this problem later. Any questions on this? Yes.
Do we stream both things at the same rate?
Yes. You stream both of them at the same rate. They are obviously not going to stream at the same rate, because images will consume lot more data than audio samples, right? So this may be going, audio you can capture 64 kbps, 28 kbps, whether it's stereo quality, mono audio, depending on that, this may be in kilobits per second. Images or video take much more bandwidth. If you're doing HD quality streaming, this may be megabits per second. Okay, so you have two streams coming to you at vastly different rates. All right, any other questions here? So we'll just switch to naming. Okay, so we have finished another chapter in the book. Okay, so we are moving on. So communication chapter is done. We are moving on to the next one, which is naming. Okay. This is a sort of a short chapter. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. Okay. So the basic problem that we are trying to address here is how do you figure out where a resource is that you are trying to access in a distributed system. Okay. What we will assume is any resource, whether it's a machine, whether it's a file, whether it's a piece of data or a hardware resource, has a name. And you basically use the name to access that resource. Okay. And previously we said the way we will do this is we'll have a directory service, and the resource will be registered with the directory service. And the directory service will then resolve the name for you and say this is where the object resides. Okay. In our case, because we have multiple machines, the object may be on any machine. So if you say, where is this object in my system, the directory service will say, go to this machine, it's at this location or this port number. The object could be simply a server that's listening, it could be a file, it could be any abstract object. Okay. So we need to have two things in, to sort of address this naming issue. You need to first have a naming convention. How do you assign names to objects? And then how do you resolve names? Okay. So name resolution is going to happen through a directory service, and we look at two examples of directory services today. So one is going to be DNS, okay, which is going to resolve names in the internet. It will map machine names to IP addresses. Another one is LDAP. That's more general directory service. You can use it to give any name and resolve to any value. Okay, so basically a key value lookup directory service. Okay. So that's basically what the problem of naming is. How do you assign names? How do you resolve names? Okay? And how do you build directory services? Now, since we are talking about distributed systems, we will also look at a scenario where your directory service is itself not centralized, but it is distributed. If you have a very large distributed system, the number of objects that you have registered with the directory service may be far too large to run the entire directory service on one machine. Okay? So a directory service itself will be distributed. Okay? We look at DNS as an example of this. Yeah, the DNS basically allows you to specify a name, it gives you an IP address. You don't have one server that is going to keep track of every IP address of every machine in the world and has the name to address mapping. Okay? That there are far too many machines and there are far too many concurrent requests for a single machine to handle this. So you have to distribute the naming service itself. Okay. So we'll see how do you design distributed naming services also as a part of looking at naming. Okay. So that's the introduction to what's basically the topic and what we are going to look at. Okay. So we are going to look at two approaches. Not look at. There are two approaches to constructing a directory service. One is a hierarchical approach. The other one is using a P2P approach. Okay. We already looked when I mentioned peer-to-peer system. I already said these are essentially key value lookup mechanisms. So you could construct a directory service where the key is the name of the object and the value is whatever it resolves to, and you register it with the P2P system. And whenever you want to do a lookup, you basically inject a request saying what is the values for this key, because it's key comma value is the sort of all the record stored. So it is going to basically propagate, do a lookup and hand back an answer. Okay, so P2P systems are one way to construct directory services. But for reasons of time, we are not going to spend too much on this part of it because we already encountered this some. I'm going to talk a little bit more about hierarchy, a way to construct naming systems that are hierarchical and distributed. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time on the hierarchical part of it. Okay, so before we delve into how the directory service looks, let's spend a little bit of time looking at how to name objects. I'm going to take two examples of naming. One is file names, the other one is URLs. The URLs are basically your things that you use to access web pages. Okay? And the claim is both of these naming schemes essentially use a hierarchical mechanism. If you just look at what a file name structure looks like, so let's say there's basically a name of a file which is /home/teen/mbox. Okay? That's typically a file name. Okay? It's called a fully qualified file name. Okay? Let's say if you're trying to access a file, maybe you just call it project1.java. But that's really a shorthand convention for your file name. The actual name of the file has to have the entire directory structure sort of prefixed to it. And that's the real name of your file. So this is basically the naming convention that an operating system uses to name files. Okay. And if you look at the way the file tree looks like, so here is your root directory. Okay. In the root directory there is a subdirectory called home. Okay. In that subdirectory there is another subdirectory called steam. In there is a file called mbox. This is essentially the name of the inbox or the mail file for this user on that system. So what this should show you is that the naming convention is hierarchical in this case. Files are grouped into folders or directories. Directories are themselves grouped into other directories all the way until the root directory. Okay. So this is basically, this is something you should already know. But now, if you basically present this file name to the OS saying, I want to open this file, what does the OS have to do, or the file system has to do? It has to do what's called name resolution. Okay. Name resolution basically says you have to basically parse the structure of the file name. You also have to descend down the tree structure until you find the file you're looking for. So the way you do name resolution, and this is just a very simple example to show you how other directory services actually do name resolution. You start from the top. You will say, okay, I'm going to start at the root directory. See, is there a directory called home? You will actually look in the file system and say, yes, there is a directory called home. You will go and open that directory and say, in that directory, is there a subdirectory called steam? Okay. And then you look and say, yes, I found one that has that name, and then you open that directory and say, okay, in that subdirectory called steam, is there a file called mbox? Can you look and say, yes, I found a file called mbox, and that will basically lead you to the file you're looking for. Okay. Every time any application on your machine opens a file, the OS has to actually run through this process of name resolution until you find the file you're looking for. Okay. The exact same principle will apply when we do name resolution in a larger directory system. Okay. You will basically take the name, which will typically be hierarchical, and you will resolve it in part. You will start with the top structure of the name, you will resolve it one step at a time until you get to whatever you are looking for. Okay. This is just a simple example to illustrate to you how the names can be hierarchical, and name resolution also has to follow this hierarchical structure to find whatever object you are looking for. In this case, the object is a file. questions on this before we actually go into some more details? Okay, so we will come back to name resolution in the file system case when we talk about distributed file system somewhat later on in the course. Okay? When we do that, this is just a sort of a preview, one slide preview of the what we see in a distributed file system scenario. So we will look at the example of NFS in that case, which is a network file system. Here there's a file server, which is this machine, and a client, which is that. So there's a client server file server. Okay? So in this case, what the file that you're trying to access is actually a remote file. Okay, so the name resolution process that I talked about here doesn't actually happen on one machine, it is split across multiple machines. The client is trying to open a file. This file actually resides on a different machine. Okay, so the name resolution also has to basically follow the same process. So when the client tries to open his or her mail, the user tries to open his or her mail, the local machine will say, I need to look for this inbox file, where is it? Okay, you will figure out that in this case it's a remote mount, it's a volume mounted. Again, you basically send that file name off to the server saying, go resolve this for me, right? And tell me what file I need to look for. So the name resolution is actually going to happen on the server, because the server is where the file is stored. Okay? Because in NFS, these mailboxes are assumed, or home directories are assumed to be stored on a remote machine. Okay? Same will be true in our case, where the name resolution is actually not going to happen on the user machine, it's going to happen remotely somewhere else, and the naming service will do it for us. Okay. So with that background, let's talk a little bit now about real naming service. Okay. So we just looked at file servers and name resolution as an example of how all of this process works. Now let's look at a global distributed naming service. Okay. So in large distributed system, the name service itself is going to be assumed to be hierarchical. There are multiple, so the namespace is hierarchical, the structure of the directory service is also hierarchical. Okay. So we'll assume that there are 3 layers, and this is best shown by, I think, a picture that I have on the next slide. So this is the structure of names of machines in the internet. This is how DNS name structure looks like. Okay. There are top level domains, okay, .com, .edu, .gov. There are top level domains for countries, and there are lots of other domains that are popped up now. So here is .jp is Japan, and then Netherlands, .us is US. So these are all top level domains. So this is referred to as the global layer of your distributed naming service. Okay. The next layer is referred to as the administrative layer. Okay, so these are names that are controlled by an individual organization. The top level names are global. Okay, so in this case, you might have .edu and you have Yale. That's sort of the name for machines that belong to Yale University. You may have UMass here, so that's umass.edu. So that part of the namespace is controlled by that organization to which that name is assigned to. Okay? And you know lots of these for .com. Every company will have a .com domain. So you have Sun and IBM. So that part of the namespace, which is the administrative layer, is going to be controlled by a particular organization. Okay? Within that namespace, you might have subdomains. Okay? So you may have cs.umass.edu, cs.yale.edu. So these are departments within that organization. Each of them may control some part of their own namespace. Okay? All of this is in the administrative layer. What's at the leaf is essentially end machines. Okay? So if you basically go, let's say you are www.cs.umass.edu, that machine called www is actually going to be the leaf node of this tree. Okay? That represents a machine. Okay? CS represents a department, UMass represents the name for an organization, EDU is basically your part of a top level domain. Okay? So I presume this is somewhat clear, but now we are going to dig a little deeper into it. Now a few things to keep in mind. The global layer, there is infrequent changes at that layer. Okay? The domains that are there change rarely. Yes, occasionally a domain may get added depending on approval. Okay? So there are very infrequent changes at the global layer of your naming service. Okay? Administrative layer, there will be changes, but somewhat more frequently than the administrative layer, much more frequently than the administrative layer, I mean, so the global layer, but also not as frequent. Every time you register a domain, let's say you can go buy a domain for yourself. Okay, that will basically add a node to this tree, depending on what domain you're registering. Or if your domain expires and gets deleted, it will take out a node from this tree. Okay? So there will be changes at the frequency of registration and deallocation of this or unregistering domains. Okay? At the bottommost level is where the most frequent changes happen. Okay? So domains might be registered, but once a domain is registered, assumed to be long-lived, because machines come and go, machine names change over time and so on. Okay, so the most frequent changes are going to actually occur at the lowest layer. The next most frequent changes here, and there are infrequent or almost no changes at the top layer. This is something to keep in mind. And this is basically has some implications on how you are going to design your naming service based on where updates occur and how you deal with them. Okay, is that clear? Alright, so I already mentioned all this, saying there's 3 layers and what the scope of it is and what frequency of changes occur and so on. Okay. Now let's take a little bit deeper look at DNS as an example, since that we started with that. So at this basic form, DNS is also a form of a directory lookup service. You can specify a machine name and it will give you some records that correspond to the machine. So the name of the machine is the key. The value that you are getting is a record that the key will match. Okay, so it's also some form of a key value lookup. But there are different kinds of records that you can create in the DNS system, and what this table is showing is different kinds of records that you can create. Okay. So the simplest kind of record is what's called the A record. A record is essentially a host record. This simply takes the name of a machine and maps it to an IP address. Yeah, that's the simplest form of a record. There are many others. Okay. Another very common type of record is what's called a CNAME. Okay, this is, you can create an alias for a machine that you already registered. Okay. So this gives a second name to that machine that you can refer to it by. And I'll show some examples in just a moment. And there are some more. There's an NS record which says that for this organization, this is the address of the DNS server. Okay, that's the name service itself. There are MX records which are sort of mail records. This is going to say for this organization, this is the mail server. So if you want to send mail to this machine, you should actually contact this other machine instead. Okay, so these are all the kinds of records that you will see. There are many others, okay, but mostly we don't care much about the rest. The 4 that are most important I talked about. Let me just show you some examples. If I can make this a little smaller. Okay, so you can say host -v and give a name. So I'm just doing a name resolution. Okay, so you're going to get a very long request. Okay, so I tried to look up this machine called none.cs.umass.edu. Okay, and what came back is saying here's an A record for the machine. Okay, that's the name of the machine, that's the IP address of the machine. Okay, there's a lot of other information that came back which we can ignore. But just if you want to look at it, it will say for this domain, which is cs.umass.edu domain, in this case there are 5 name servers. Okay? And so that's basically an NS record. Okay? So these are the DNS servers that have entries for this machine. Okay? You can ask any one of them and they'll tell you the IP address. You'll see there are 2 DNS servers that run by UMass. There's one run by engineering. There is one run by CS, there's actually 3 run by UMass, NS1, NS2, NS. So all of these name servers actually replicate the data. So asking any one of them will help you get this resolution. Okay, so that's also stored as part of it. There are some additional sections that we can ignore. I'm sure there's an MX record somewhere. So here is a MX record for this machine. Say, if you want to send mail to a user at this machine, you should basically, that's an MX record, say send it here instead. This is the mail gateway for the department here. So any mail that comes in first lands up here. And this machine will then look at it, do some virus checks and whatever, and then forward it. In this case, if it's distant for here, it will go here. So all of this information is actually in your DNS record. Okay, that was an example. We looked at an A record, we looked at some NS records and an MX record. So I'm going to show you some other examples. Okay, so I'll show you another, let's do another name resolution. So I did a name resolution on a machine called las.cs.umass.edu that happens to be a group server, and what came back is this is the answer. So it says this machine name is essentially a C name which is a pointer to this machine. This is simply an alias. There's no such real machine. It's just another name for that machine, which is what we resolved earlier, and the IP address of that actual machine is this. Okay. So you can have as many aliases as you want for a given machine. There has to be an A record, but you can have lots of C name records that all point to the same machine. They're all aliases. Okay. Alias is simply a second name for that machine. So you can have multiple names that all map onto the same IP address, okay, using C records. Okay? Any questions here? Right. So I said you can have multiple names for the same machine. Now let's look at some other things and see whether. I'm going to just do. I don't need to go in SV anymore. Okay, so I just resolved www.cnn.com. And what came back was that, okay, it's an alias, and this alias, that's the real name, but then it returned not one, but 4 IP addresses. Okay, so it says, if you want to go here, here are 4 IP addresses that answer to that name. Okay, so this is a case where one name maps onto multiple IP addresses. Okay. The previous case I showed multiple aliases that point to one IP address. This is a reverse situation. There are 4 names mapping onto one name mapping onto 4 IP addresses. Now you may ask, why should you do this? Okay, so let's think a little bit about why should you have multiple machines answering to the same name.
For load balancing purposes.
Okay, so you can do load balancing purposes. So you can see that this is the website for CNN. Okay, presumably it's a very popular site. And what they have done is they have created 4 replicas. In this case, these are the 4 machines. All of them store the same web content. Okay. So when your browser tries to resolve this, it will actually get this list. Typically, it will pick the first entry that matches. Okay. And then, so if, in this case, the browser would actually go onto the first machine there and connect it to that machine. So if you try to resolve it again, you'll see that every time you resolve, a different entry is returned at the top. So here the 11 was resolved and here the 13 is resolved. So what DNS is doing is it's scrambling the order in which it sends back the response. So what this means is some browsers will connect to the first machine in the list and some will connect to the second, because I assume that if there are multiple matches, the browser may pick the first one. This is what, or it will pick one at random, in which case you don't need to scramble. But if you just pick the first one, you just, every time you resolve, you return that list in a different order, in a different first machine. Okay? This will automatically load balance for your web server. So you don't need to do anything special. So I'm just going to see one more of them will work. Not very too much more this. Okay. So that's essentially DNS. Okay, so we looked at examples of how you have A record, C record. So it's up to administrators to go and make these changes and configure it in the right way and so on, depending on the scenario you're looking for. So let's look a little bit about the name resolution aspect of it. So the way you are resolving this name is the same hierarchical resolution that we saw in file systems, okay, file names. Okay, so if you want to resolve this name, which is ftp.cs.vu.nl, okay, this is what's going to come from the client name resolution. This is what you're going to do. You're going to first go to the top level root server for this name. In this case, it's a country root server for Netherlands. And this is sort of the website of the author of the textbook. Okay, so you go there and say, I want to resolve this name, what should I do? Okay, so it will say that, okay, the next level domain is the university. Okay, and it will send you the name server of the university. Okay, so then you iteratively go to the university, which is the, well, first you will go to the country, and then you will go to the university here. and say what should I do, it will send you to the name server for the department. Okay, then you'll say, okay, I want to resolve a machine called FTP that's under you, and that you send to that name server, and it will actually point you to the machine. Okay. So iteratively go to each level of the tree and you find the name server for that level in the name, and you basically resolve the next level until you hit a node. So each of this is going to require a round trip time. So if this is, you are resolving, let's say a name that is in, so a machine belongs to Asia, you'll basically have lots of round trips to name servers that are all based in Asia. So this may take a while before you go and resolve this. Okay? Now luckily for you, once you resolve some of these top level names, DNS allows your client machine to cache some of the results. So in this case, you might cache the name server for the country, the name server for EU, name server C. So next time, if you, let's say, if you just say www.cs.vu.nl, you don't have to go through the whole process because you already cached the lowest level name server here. You can directly go there and access it. Okay? So this will help. So if in many cases, so if you say, if you are browsing the web, lots of names end at .com. You are not going to go to the authoritative name server for .com every time. You will actually cache a lot of that, and you don't have to do some of that resolution. Simply by caching, you can avoid this overhead. Now you can ask for how long should you cache. Now this depends on what level of name server are you caching. As I said, there are infrequent changes at the top and more frequent changes at the bottom. So when the name is resolved, the name server will actually put an expiration time on how long you are allowed to cache that data. If it's top level, country level server, you can cache it for long periods of time because it's unlikely to change. If there are low level name servers, you try to not cache it for more than an hour, let's say. Because you can say that an hour is good enough, changes might occur, so you basically have to throw it out after an hour and redo that resolution. Okay? So the lower down that you are in the tree, the less free you should cache it. I mean, the less is the amount of time you should cache it for, because names may change and then that will require you to re-resolve it. Otherwise, you may get errors. Okay? So these are some of the design decisions you can actually use to decide when to cache. So that was iterative resolution. There's another way to do this, which is hierarchical. Okay? So you want to resolve the same name, ftp.cs.vu.nl. In this case, you just send the request to the root name server saying, go resolve this name. Okay? The root server will figure out what is the next level server to pick, and it will forward it to that name server. And this will keep resolving it until that request trickles down all the way to the base name server. We'll resolve the name, and then the results will trickle back up, and then you get back a request from the response. Okay? Yes.
So how the machine know the root server name server's IP address?
Question is, how do you know the root name server's IP address? So that basically is the way DNS works. That some of the highest level name servers are well known and they are pre-configured by the DNS system. Right? So when you set up a local DNS server, okay, you have to configure that in your local DNS server. So what your browser will do is it will simply send your request to the local name server. The local name server has configured that information. Otherwise, you can't do this. Right? So you need to at least know the names of the root. So root name servers are well known, they are well advertised. Every DNS server knows what it is, so you can always start from the top and trickle. You don't need to know any of the rest. You can always start at the top and ask the top, what should I do, and it will tell you what to do. Okay? But that you need to know. Okay? So those name servers are critical. Okay? They actually have a very high load, but they are well known, well advertised in the DNS system. Any other question? But that's a good point. You need to know where to start. Otherwise you cannot do it. Okay, so this is recursive. So in this case, the request trickles down and the responses trickle up. And then you get back a reply. Okay, so I want to spend 2 minutes trying to understand what might be pros and cons of whether to do iterative, which is what we showed here, versus recursive, which is what we showed there. Yes.
Well, with recursive, you can do the same caching scheme, but it will be more local, or hopefully be more local.
So that's the first high-level thing you should keep in mind, that if you are doing recursive, the client cannot really cache all intermediate results because they are being resolved within the name system. The client is not involved. So you cannot cache, that's a downside. The upside is if all these name servers are far away, okay, this overhead of long round trip times, okay, all US to Europe round trip times, there are multiple of these round trip times, they go away because you send one request. That request goes to the root server, from there it goes to a server in Europe, and then it trickles down locally, and these are presumably all near to one another. So that resolution will be faster then. Okay, so you have eliminated the overhead of long RTTs or round trip time and reduce that overhead. Yes.
You can also control for like what the client's caching, because in the recursive thing, right? Like if I have the CS name server and I don't want the client to cache anything, then you would use this.
So you are saying in the recursive you can or cannot cache? I didn't
Like
quite get the
you-
gist of what you just said.
Like at the root name server, you have like a wall that the client can't see past, so you can do whatever you want with caching below that.
Right. So you can cache internally within the naming system, but the client cannot cache all the intermediate result. It can of course cache the last thing that came back. So that you can cache. So next time you want to go to FTP CS, you don't have to do this. You already figured out what it is. Okay. So that you will always cache the final thing, but you may not be able to cache the name server. So in the previous case, you are actually caching not only the final result, but the IP addresses of these name servers. So if you want to go back to the same university, you don't have to start from the top. You can go to wherever you want to start with and continue from
I
there.
thought in the recursive case you're only returning the answer, so.
Yeah, you can. You only return the answer, but
Yeah,
but you can always cache the answer as well. Okay, but you won't cache these things because these are only cached here. What you only get is IP address there. That's all you can cache. Your point is.
So, for individual resolution, and the request can be distributed to many servers, but for this recursive, every request needs to go through the root. So,
Okay. That's a good point. In recursive resolution, every request resolution has to go through the root. Okay. In iterative, because there is a lot of caching going on, in many cases you will short circuit the first 2 or 3 steps and directly go to some local name server that you cached and continue from there. Okay. So that's a good point. So in the iterative, the recursive case, the root server better have a lot of capacity. Every DNS request that anybody is making in the world has to go through the root server. Okay, so you think about the number of users, you have billions. Okay, and every time they have to do a DNS request, your local name resolver is going to send it off to the root. That's not one machine, that's a group of machines, but nevertheless, the load at the root is going to be very high. Because not only does the request start there, all the replies also flow back through it. Okay, the reply doesn't actually go directly, it is in this case trickling up and going back. Okay, so the higher up you are in the hierarchy, the name servers have higher load because not only are they resolving, they are also sending back all the replies. The iterative case is a bit more distributed because the replies directly go from the local name server back to the client. There is caching, you don't have to always start at the top, you have cached intermediate entries and so on. Okay. But you may have to actually incur these higher round trip times if you have nothing cached. There are always trade-offs. There is no clear picture of what is the right answer of which one to pick. Okay. Each one will have its pros and cons. Okay. So that's recursive and iterative. We'll not go any further. So this is just showing you just that in the iterative there are all these round trip times that you have to account for. Okay, so the longer it takes, the more time it's going to take for you to resolve and before anything useful happens in your system. Okay. So that's all we have as far as DNS is concerned. I'm going to talk about another directory service just to give you a flavor of something different. Okay. This one is called X.500. What is the difference between this directory service and DNS? DNS is essentially a very simple name service. It's a key value lookup. You specify a key, it gives you a value. Okay, if that is all you are looking for in your directory service, I think you are good. Now there are many types of lookups where you may need to make more general purpose requests, say, and try to get back responses. Okay, I'll give you an example. So let's take example of yellow pages of a phone book. So if you want to look for a plumber, you don't know the name of the plumber, you just want to look up a plumber. What you are going to do is you are going to say, find me all the plumbers that are listed in the phone book. The query you are going to make to the directory service is return all records of type plumber. Okay, you will not say person XYZ plumbing service because you don't even know the name of that. So this is the equivalent of saying return me the list of all machines in the CS department. So your request is star.cs.umass.edu where star is a wildcard. Okay, so you want to get many requests that match a particular query. That kind of lookups are not possible in DNS. DNS is very simple. Specify complete key, you get back a response. That's it. But there may be many other kinds of directory services where you do want to have more general purpose queries. You may want to specify part of a name and get back all entries that match it. Okay, so to do these kinds of queries, you have more general purpose directory services, of which X.500 is an example. It's a OSI standard, it's very complicated. It actually never really took off, but simpler flavors of it are actually in wide use. And one simple flavor is what is referred to as LDAP, okay? Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. This is a variant of X.500, which is a simplification in some sense, but it still allows you to sort of have this more general purpose request and returns back all the responses and so on. Okay? This directory service is widely used in most operating systems. Practically every OS, if you take Windows or whether you take Linux or Mac, they will have some flavor of LDAP. Okay, the Unix world, Open LDAP is a popular implementation of LDAP. In the Windows world, you have Active Directory. If you know anything about Windows, you know there are ADS servers, as Active Directory services. They're all basically built on top of LDAP. So what you can do with it is basically you can use it for a variety of different lookups that you want to do in a distributed system. Okay, so you can store username and passwords. When you try to log in, you specify your username, you specify your password, you go to the directory service and say, does this password match this username? The directory service says yes, you let the user log in. If it says no, you say incorrect password. So username passwords can be stored centrally in the directory service rather than locally on the machine. Okay. That's one common use of directory services. Another use is basically to look up, to use it to have a directory of people and their phone numbers and office locations. And that's another example of where you can also store any centralized resource like all the printers in the department. They could be stored in an LDAP directory, all the network printers. So you can go and fetch a list of printers and then configure them centrally and so on. So it's really a very general purpose directory service that is used in a distributed environment for a variety of reasons. Username, passwords, and looking at the people's directory, phone numbers and so on. So I'll just show you an example. So if you have used the UMass People Finder, if you used UMass People Finder on the web, that's running on a directory service. That's an LDAP server, which is essentially this one, ldap.oit.umass.edu. And what it allows you to do is specify any person's name. Okay, so this is that what you are going to look in that. So there's some general purpose directory service. So it has people records, it may have machine records, it may have people records. DNS only stores machine records, it doesn't store people information. So LDAP can store any of it. So you can look for people records within edu.umass.edu, right? So you can basically go, and there is one on the CS department which does the same thing. So basically that's the CS LDAP service. So you can basically go through any LDAP client. In this case, let's say it is just a local client here. You can specify a name and it will give you all the matches. Okay, but as you can see, if you specify part of a name, it will give you all the matches. So this is a wildcard request. You say, so give me all names that have the string SHEN. Okay, so it basically returned a list of people that have all that string embedded in their names. Okay, so it's not just a key value. You can just say basically have more wildcard requests or queries that are more general purpose. Okay, so you could also say type faculty or type student, in which case you will basically get a different type of response. Okay, so you can specify more general queries like you would do in a database. So you specify multiple attributes, get back all matching responses. Okay. So the namespace in LDAP is also hierarchical. Okay, so you start with a country which is sort of a C record, you have an organization, that's an O record, there's an organizational unit, that's OU, that's a department, there's a name server. You can have different types of record, which is there's a host name, which is a machine record, you can have people records, you can have user profile records, which are username, passwords. So very general system that allows you to do variety of, store variety of centralized information about resources, could either be people or machines. Okay. So that's basically what I have for today. So the takeaways are, we've done a very quick one lecture overview of an entire chapter in the book. Okay, so we covered a whole chapter, but as you can imagine, there's a short chapter in the book. There isn't a whole lot to take away. You have to realize that when you have any system, you need a naming scheme. It will allow you to map names to objects. The naming scheme in large systems is itself hierarchical. The namespace is hierarchical. And there are many lookup mechanisms. There's resolution mechanism, could be iterative or recursive. The way you actually look up could be a key value lookup or more general purpose query, saying return me all records of a particular type, all record matching a certain attribute, and so on. Okay, so depending on what you need, you can use the right form of a directory service. Okay, so with that, we'll end it here. And next time we are going to start another topic. Okay, so for today, we are going to start here.